I still remember the first time I saw him, the boy everyone ignored, small, pale, sitting at the bottom of the marble staircase that spiraled up like a spine through the heart of the Moretti estate. His tiny hands moved through the air in frantic, graceful shapes, a language no one else bothered to learn, his lips forming silent words as servants glided past him like he was made of smoke. The echo of their footsteps swallowed the silence that surrounded him, and I felt something sharp twist inside my chest, that peculiar ache that comes when you witness cruelty disguised as indifference. It was my first morning there, and I already knew this was not the kind of house where kindness lived easily. The Moretti mansion was vast, a palace made of cold stone and colder secrets. Every wall gleamed as if even dust was too afraid to linger. I'd been hired through an agency that didn't tell me much, only that my job was to tutor a young boy with hearing loss, that discretion was non-negotiable, and that I would be well compensated if I followed the rules. I should have known then that rules were never written for people like me. They were written to be broken, one heartbeat at a time. When the driver left me at the gate that morning, I'd rehearsed polite words, careful smiles, the tone of professionalism that kept me safe in homes where power made monsters look like men. But none of that mattered when I saw Matteo. He couldn't have been more than 6, dressed in clothes too fine for someone so small, his dark hair falling into his eyes, his face serious in that heartbreaking way children sometimes wear grief like a mask they've forgotten how to take off. He was signing something, over and over, his gestures sharp, urgent. No one looked. A maid carrying linens walked right past him, her gaze fixed ahead. A man in a suit stepped around him as if he were a piece of furniture misplaced in the hallway. The boy's hands stilled midair, trembled, and then lowered slowly to his lap, defeated. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, the kind that comes not from pity but from fury. Before I knew it, I was kneeling in front of him, my bag forgotten on the floor. "Hi," I said softly, though I knew he couldn't hear me. His eyes lifted, huge, green-gray like storm glass, and for a moment the world narrowed to just that gaze, curious and cautious all at once. I didn't know much sign language then, only the basics I'd practiced from old training videos, but kindness doesn't need fluency, only sincerity. So I raised my hands and signed, "Hello, I'm Isabella." He blinked, startled, then hesitated before responding with slow, careful motions. "Matteo." I smiled and repeated it back to him. "Matteo." His expression changed just slightly, a flicker of something I hadn't seen on his face before, a spark, a question. I pointed to myself again and signed clumsily, "Friend." His lips curved, just barely, the faintest trace of a smile that looked fragile enough to break if I blinked. He signed something in return that I didn't understand, but I caught the rhythm of it. His hands tapping his chest twice, then pointing to me. It took a second before I realized he'd said, "Thank you." That was the exact moment I felt the weight of eyes on me. I turned, and there he was. Damiano Moretti, standing at the top of the staircase, a figure carved from shadow and authority, watching in absolute silence. Everyone else in the hallway froze as if the air itself obeyed him. The man was beautiful in that dangerous way some men are, his presence filling the space like smoke. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to soften. He didn't speak, didn't move, only studied me the way a wolf might study someone foolish enough to reach for its wounded cub. I rose slowly, my pulse a storm beneath my skin. "Mr. Moretti," I began, my voice steady though my heart wasn't. "I'm the new tutor, Isabella Rossi." He descended the stairs without a word, his steps measured, deliberate. When he reached the bottom, the scent of his cologne, dark cedar and smoke, wrapped around me, disorienting and intimate. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't need to. "You're early," he said finally, his voice deep and smooth but edged with something cold, like glass. "I thought it best to meet Matteo right away," I said. His gaze flicked toward the boy, who had gone still, his small shoulders tense. "He doesn't usually like strangers. He didn't seem to mind me." A muscle moved in his jaw, the smallest betrayal of emotion. "So I see." We stood there for a heartbeat too long, the air between us taut with something unspoken. Then he turned to his son, kneeling slightly so they were eye level. His hands moved, not gracefully but awkwardly, trying to sign something I couldn't quite follow. Matteo's eyes dimmed. He shook his head and looked away. Damiano exhaled, straightened, and said to me, "He prefers silence. Don't force conversation." I wanted to tell him that silence wasn't the same as peace, that ignoring a child's voice doesn't protect them. It erases them. But something in his expression told me to swallow the words. There was grief in his face, yes, but buried under so many layers of guilt it had calcified into command. "I'll do my best," I said instead. "I hope your best is enough," he replied quietly, then turned and walked away, the weight of his authority trailing behind him like thunder. The rest of that day unfolded like a test. The staff watched me with veiled curiosity, whispering when they thought I couldn't see. Matteo followed me from room to room, silent but observant, clutching a small sketchbook that looked worn and loved. I discovered that he liked to draw faces, mostly his father's, sometimes his mother's, though no one ever mentioned her. When I asked where she was, he signed a single word before closing the book. Gone. In the afternoon, I found him sitting by the piano in the corner of the music room, his fingers tracing the keys without pressing them. I sat beside him and touched one gently, letting the sound ripple into the air. He watched the vibration, his eyes wide, then smiled. A real one this time, quick and luminous. "Do you feel that?" I asked, pressing another key, the note deep and low. He placed his palm flat against the wood, nodding. The vibrations traveled through his hand, his arm, his heart. I realized then that sound could be felt, that silence could be alive. We spent the rest of the afternoon like that, wordless but connected, communicating through rhythm and laughter and touch. When the sun began to set, I noticed Damiano standing in the doorway, half hidden in shadow. He said nothing, but his gaze wasn't as sharp as before. It was almost curious. Then as quickly as he'd appeared, he vanished. That night, as I unpacked my things in the guest room assigned to me, I found a folded piece of paper slipped under my door. The handwriting was firm and elegant. "He hasn't smiled since his mother died. Until you." I sat there for a long time, the paper trembling in my hands, the words blurring under the soft lamplight. Outside, the night pressed close against the windows, and somewhere in the mansion's depths, I could hear the faint echo of piano keys, one after another, like a heartbeat learning to trust its own rhythm again. And though I didn't know it yet, that was the moment everything began. The moment I stepped into their silence, not realizing it would soon become my own. By the second morning, the house already knew me. Or perhaps I only imagined it did, because I woke to the soft creak of the old pipes and the filtered gray light that spilled through curtains too heavy to belong anywhere but in a place that had forgotten how to breathe. Somewhere far below, I could hear the faint rhythm of footsteps, steady, measured, like the heartbeat of a man who refused to run from anything. And I knew without seeing that it was him. Damiano Moretti didn't rush, didn't stumble, didn't ever seem uncertain. He moved like gravity had been adjusted to obey him alone. Matteo met me in the dining room, hair still damp from his morning shower. The collar of his small white shirt slightly crooked, which I fixed while he watched me with those solemn eyes that seemed to hold more comprehension than most adults I'd known. He signed good morning, slowly, deliberately, then gestured toward the empty chair at the end of the long table. I followed his gaze and realized that though the breakfast spread could have fed 20, every plate near that chair remained untouched. The servants floated in and out like ghosts, replacing dishes no one would eat. He signed again. "Papa never eats here." His face didn't change, but the stillness in him said everything. I wanted to tell him that absence leaves a louder echo than any voice ever could, but instead I smiled and signed, "Then we'll eat for him." His lips twitched, and he bit back a laugh. And just like that, the silence of the room softened into something almost warm. After breakfast, we began our lesson in the sunroom, a space walled entirely in glass, where the morning light poured in like water. Matteo loved the light. It made him more alive somehow. I spread out flashcards with words and drawings: tree, rain, hope, father. When I reached that last one, his hands hesitated midair, his shoulders tightening. Then he pushed the card aside and signed, "He doesn't like when I sign that." I should have let it go, but curiosity is my worst sin. "Why?" I asked. He shrugged in that small way children do when they've already learned that some answers come with punishment. Then he pointed to his ear, signed noise, and shook his head hard. I didn't understand at first. He took my hand, placed it flat over his chest, and patted twice. Boom, his heartbeat. Then he mouthed a single word. Slow, careful, gun. A chill went through me. He was remembering the night he lost his hearing. I wanted to hold him, to tell him he was safe. But I sensed instinctively that this was not a child who trusted easily with touch. So instead I signed, "You're brave." His eyes flicked toward the doorway then, alert, wary, and I turned to find Damiano standing there, silent, his suit immaculate, his presence swallowing the fragile sunlight. For a moment he said nothing, only looked between us as if weighing whether to interrupt. "Continue," he said finally, voice calm, but low enough that I felt it more than heard it. Matteo straightened, signing quickly, "Papa, we're learning." Damiano nodded once, expression unreadable, then walked further into the room. The air changed with him. "You're teaching him well," he said to me. "He responds to you." "I think he just needed someone to listen," I replied, perhaps too boldly. His gaze sharpened, a flicker of something like surprise, or warning. "People listen," he said. "They just don't always hear what matters." I wanted to ask what he heard when his son tried to speak, but the question felt dangerous, like stepping barefoot onto broken glass. Instead, I asked if he wanted to join the lesson. The offer hung in the air between us, absurd in its simplicity. For a moment, I thought he'd refuse. Then, to my astonishment, he removed his jacket, rolled his cuffs, and sat beside Matteo. The boy stared at him, eyes wide. Damiano looked at me as if daring me to correct him. I showed him the sign for father. He mirrored it, clumsy at first, his fingers stiff. But he tried again and again until Matteo giggled silently, covering his mouth. Damiano's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, and for one fleeting second, I saw what he might have been before power hardened him. Just a man trying to reach his son through a wall, built of guilt and silence. When the lesson ended, he stood abruptly, buttoning his cuffs back into precision. "He trusts you," he said, tone neutral but eyes unsteady. "That's unusual." "Trust isn't given," I said. "It's noticed." He studied me for a long moment, then left without another word. The echo of his footsteps lingered even after the door closed, and I realized I was trembling. Not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. That evening, the mansion seemed different. Quieter, though I didn't think that possible. I found myself wandering its halls, drawn by curiosity more than sense, until I reached a room I hadn't seen before. The door was half open. Inside, the faint glow of lamplight revealed a grand piano, its surface covered with dust, except for one clean streak, where fingers had traced across it recently. Sheet music lay scattered on the floor. I stepped inside, unable to resist. "Miss Rossi." His voice came from the shadows, low and even, and I turned to see Damiano seated in an armchair near the window, a glass of whiskey balanced in one hand. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said quickly. He gestured toward the piano. "Do you play?" "A little," I admitted, "then play." It wasn't a request. I hesitated, then sat. My fingers found a melody I hadn't played in years, soft, melancholic, something my mother used to hum when the world outside our apartment felt too loud. The notes filled the room, delicate and trembling, and when I finally stopped, the silence that followed felt almost holy. Damiano spoke quietly, almost to himself. "That was her song." "Matteo's mother?" He nodded, staring into the amber swirl of his drink. "She played every night. He would fall asleep beside the piano. After she died, he stopped hearing anything." I wanted to reach out, to touch the grief in his voice, but I knew better. Men like him didn't allow comfort. They allowed confession only in fragments, then buried them again. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He looked up then, and for the first time I saw pain unmasked. Raw, unguarded. "Don't be," he said. "Sorry changes nothing." He stood, setting his glass aside. "You should know something, Miss Rossi. People in this house will tell you stories. They'll warn you about me. Believe half of them. The rest are worse." "I'm not afraid of stories," I said softly. "You should be afraid of me." He stepped closer, stopping just short of touch. The air between us trembled with the weight of words unsaid. His eyes, dark and burning, lingered on mine. "Good night," he murmured, and then he was gone, the scent of smoke and rain following him out. Later, in my room, I couldn't sleep. The house felt alive, breathing, listening. I thought of Matteo's small hands shaping words in the air, of Damiano's larger ones mimicking, them with unsteady grace, of the way grief could carve people into strangers even to themselves. I thought of the way he'd looked at me just before leaving, as though I'd reminded him of something he didn't want to remember. When I finally drifted toward sleep, a sound pulled me back, a soft tapping at the door. I opened it to find no one, only a folded napkin on the floor. Inside, written in the same strong hand as before, were 5 words that made my pulse stop. "He's watching you. Be careful." The next morning, I woke before dawn, the sky outside still a bruised shade of blue that hadn't yet learned how to be day. The mansion was quiet, that kind of hushed stillness that feels almost deliberate, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. I dressed quietly and walked down the long corridor toward the sunroom, the same place where light had once seemed kind, but now felt cautious, filtered through heavy glass that carried the chill of secrets. Matteo was already there, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a stack of flashcards spread around him like fallen leaves. He was tracing letters with his finger. Slow, methodical, precise. I didn't speak, didn't move, only watched him for a moment, wondering how long he'd been awake, how long he'd been living in a silence no one tried to understand. When he noticed me, he smiled, quick and small, the kind that flickers like a candle flame and disappears too fast. He pointed to the window, where dawn was starting to break, and signed, "Beautiful." I sat beside him and signed back, "Yes, you too." He laughed soundlessly, that bright kind of laughter that only shows in the eyes, and reached for one of the flashcards. It read, "Love." He hesitated before holding it up, looking at me as though searching for permission to ask something he didn't quite have words for. "Do you know this one?" I signed. He nodded, then signed it back with deliberate care. The hand over the heart, the small forward motion. Love. Something inside me twisted, tender and sharp. Who taught you that? I asked. He hesitated, then signed a single word. Mama. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts. I wanted to say something, anything. But before I could, movement at the door drew my attention. Damiano stood there, one hand braced against the frame, his dark suit impeccable even in the pale morning light. His gaze moved from me to his son, lingering there longer than usual. And for a moment I thought I saw something fragile in his expression, something dangerously close to longing. Good morning, I said softly. He nodded once, stepped inside, and crouched near Matteo. You're up early, he said, voice low, controlled, almost gentle. Matteo watched his lips, caught the words, and signed quickly. I'm learning. Damiano's eyes flicked to me, a question unspoken, and I signed the word love for him to see, slow enough that he could follow. His expression didn't change, but his gaze darkened, focused. He looked back at his son. Show me, he said. Matteo repeated the sign, his hand against his chest, the same soft motion outward. For a second, Damiano's face broke open, barely perceptible but enough to reveal a wound that had never healed. Then he reached out, covered Matteo's small hand with his own, and repeated the motion. Slow, clumsy, reverent. I couldn't look away. It was the first time I'd seen him touch his son without restraint, without fear that tenderness might shatter him. After a long silence, he stood. He learns fast, he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. He does, I replied, but only when someone listens. He looked at me then, really looked, and something wordless passed between us, an understanding too fragile to name. He turned to leave but paused in the doorway. Miss Rossi, he said, you're changing things here. I didn't know if it was a warning or a confession. Later that day, the air grew heavy with the scent of rain. The servants moved quickly, closing windows, lowering shutters. I found Matteo in the library, his small body curled up on a leather chair, sketchbook balanced on his knees. When I came closer, I saw that he was drawing his father. The lines were simple but careful, the strong jaw, the cold eyes. But there was softness there too, in the way he shaded the hands. That's beautiful, I said. He smiled, then flipped to a new page and began to draw again. This time it was me. I laughed quietly, pointing at the exaggerated curls he'd given my hair. He shrugged, amused, then wrote a single word at the bottom of the page in uneven letters. Friend. The sound of thunder rolled outside, and he flinched so suddenly that the pencil snapped in his hand. His breath quickened. His eyes went wide, searching for something that wasn't there. I knelt in front of him, took his hands gently. It's okay, I signed. Just thunder. But his body stayed tense, trembling. Without thinking, I pulled him into my arms. He resisted for a second, then melted against me, his heartbeat wild against my chest. I rocked him slowly, whispering even though he couldn't hear me. You're safe, Matteo. I promise. When he finally calmed, I felt eyes on me again, an awareness before sound. I turned and saw Damiano standing at the edge of the library, half in shadow, his hands clenched at his sides. His face was unreadable, but his eyes looked like a man remembering what it felt like to lose everything, and fearing it was happening again. I'm sorry, I began, pulling back slightly from Matteo, but he lifted his hand, silencing me. You did nothing wrong, he said. He trusts you. That's more than I've managed in years. There was something brittle in his tone, something that cracked just enough for me to glimpse the man beneath the myth. He's just afraid of the storm, I said quietly. So am I, he murmured, The admission was so soft I almost thought I imagined it. He crossed the room slowly, then knelt beside Matteo, who looked up at him, uncertain. Damiano signed, awkwardly but sincerely. Safe, promise. The boy nodded, touching his father's wrist gently before resting his head against his shoulder. And there, in the dim light, framed by the echo of rain and thunder, the feared Mafia boss of Rome looked nothing like a monster. He looked like a man who'd forgotten how to be human, but was trying to remember. That night I couldn't stop replaying the moment. The way his voice had softened, the way his hand had trembled when he touched his son, the way my heart had begun to ache for something I had no right to want. I told myself it was empathy, nothing more. But empathy doesn't burn. It doesn't make your pulse stumble when you hear his footsteps in the hallway outside your door. When I finally drifted into sleep, the storm had passed, leaving only the slow rhythm of dripping water from the eaves. I dreamed of hands, his and mine, reaching across darkness, signing words that didn't exist, inventing a language made entirely of silence. When I woke, there was another note slipped beneath my door, the same paper, the same deliberate handwriting. He watched you with something I've never seen before. Don't break him, Miss Rossi. He doesn't know how to heal twice. By the time the week turned, I'd begun to understand that the Moretti mansion was less a home and more a labyrinth built from grief. Every corridor hid a story, and every locked door whispered of one. There were rooms I had yet to see, wings the servants avoided, staircases that led down to darkness instead of up to light. And though I tried to keep my curiosity buried beneath professionalism, it grew like ivy in the corners of my mind, curling tighter each time I caught Damiano watching me, as if he already knew that I was searching for something I shouldn't. Matteo, however, seemed lighter. He'd started signing faster, more confidently, his gestures smoother, his laughter silent but contagious. In the afternoons, we sat near the old fountain in the garden, where the water dripped through cracks in the marble like a heartbeat refusing to stop. Sometimes he drew while I read, other times we simply sat together, existing in that quiet that felt less like silence and more like understanding. It was during one of those soft, golden hours that he signed something new, something that made the hair on my arms rise. Papa has a secret room, he told me, eyes flicking toward the house as if it might hear. I smiled, pretending not to take it seriously. What kind of secret room? I signed back. He leaned close and whispered, though whispering made no difference to him. Mama's room. He doesn't go there anymore. It's locked. I asked where, but he only shook his head and went back to drawing, as if the conversation had never happened. I let it go outwardly, but inside something shifted. A secret room. A wife gone too soon. A man who built walls around both his son and his heart. Every piece of it pulled at me like a thread unraveling from a fabric I wasn't supposed to touch. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, the sound loud in a house that otherwise tried to pretend it was dead. Somewhere beyond my door, footsteps moved, slow, heavy, deliberate. For a moment I thought it might be the servants on their rounds, but these steps had a different cadence, one I'd learned to recognize. Damiano. I rose, pulled my robe around me and stepped into the hallway. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. I followed the sound down a narrow passage I hadn't walked before, past portraits whose painted eyes followed me like witnesses. The steps stopped in front of a door at the very end, the only one without gold trim, its surface plain, almost worn. I pressed myself against the wall, breath shallow as the door creaked open. For a heartbeat, I saw inside. Dim light, shadows moving, a glint of something metallic. Then the door closed, and the key turned with a low click. He didn't see me. I stayed there, frozen, until I heard him walking away again, his pace slower now, almost burdened. When the sound of his footsteps faded, I stepped toward the door and laid my hand against it. The wood was cold. Beneath my palm, I could feel the faint hum of something electric. A light left on, maybe, or a machine still running. I told myself to walk away, but my pulse refused to obey. The next morning, Matteo was quiet. He drew more than he signed, filling page after page with the same image, an open door with light pouring through it. When I asked what it meant, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed older than they should be and signed, "You'll see soon." Later, during our lesson, Damiano entered the room unexpectedly. He carried a file in one hand, his tie loosened, the faintest shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes. "How is he doing?" he asked, voice even, but his gaze lingered on Matteo's drawing. "Better every day," I said. "He's starting to express himself more. Through art, mostly." He nodded, set the file down, then turned to his son. "Matteo, come here." The boy approached, hesitant but trusting. Damiano crouched down, gesturing for his attention, and signed clumsily, "Proud of you." It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Matteo smiled so wide it nearly broke my heart. He threw his arms around his father's neck, and for a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Damiano closed his eyes, his hand coming up to steady the small body clinging to him, and I realized then that he wasn't made of steel at all. He was made of glass, polished, sharp, but capable of breaking if held too tightly. When Matteo ran off to fetch one of his drawings, Damiano stood and looked at me. "He trusts you completely now," he said quietly. "You've done something none of my money or men could do." "It's not money he needed," I said. "It was love." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and his eyes caught mine instantly, the air between us thickening. "Be careful, Miss Rossi," he murmured. "Love has ruined greater families than mine. Maybe because they mistook love for weakness." He stepped closer, too close, the faintest trace of a smile ghosting across his lips. "And which do you think I am?" "I think," I whispered. "You're afraid to find out." For a second, he didn't breathe. Then Matteo returned, clutching another drawing, a family of 3 holding hands beneath a blue sky. He showed it proudly, and Damiano's composure faltered. He looked at me one last time, something raw flickering across his face, then turned away. "Dinner's at 8, he said, voice clipped again, as if the moment had never happened. That evening, the mansion glowed with candlelight, but underneath it I felt the tension like static. During dinner, Damiano spoke little, his attention half on his phone, half on the quiet rhythm of Matteo's hands as he told me about his day. When the meal ended, Damiano excused himself and left through the same corridor as before, the one that led toward that plain door at the far end of the house. I waited. When the servants cleared the table and the house settled back into silence, I followed. Every instinct told me to stop, but curiosity has a sound. It beats against your ribs like a second heartbeat, whispering just one more step. I reached the door, tried the handle, locked, as before. I leaned closer, listening. The hum was still there. And then faintly I heard something else, a mechanical click, the sound of gears shifting, and beneath it, a softer sound that made my blood run cold. A woman's voice, recorded, distorted, faint. "Damiano. Please. He's just a child." I stumbled back, my breath catching, the voice cut off. Silence swallowed everything. I turned to leave, but when I looked up, he was there. Damiano stood at the end of the hall, half in shadow, half in the dim gold light from the sconces, watching me with eyes that could burn through glass. Neither of us spoke. The space between us felt alive, dangerous. He took one slow step forward, his voice low and measured when it finally came. "You shouldn't be here." I heard, He raised a hand, silencing me. Whatever you think you heard, forget it. Was that her voice? I whispered. His mother. Something inside him cracked at the question. I saw it. But he didn't answer. He just exhaled, long and weary, then said, "Some doors in this house were never meant to open again." And then, as he passed me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, he added, almost like a confession, "But maybe you're the one who will." It had rained all night, a restless kind of rain that seemed to wash over the house without cleansing it, whispering secrets against the windows as though even the storm wanted to be heard. By morning, the air smelled of wet earth and iron, the sky still gray with indecision. Matteo had begged to go outside after breakfast, his fingers flying through the air with a speed that made me laugh. Damiano hesitated, standing by the window, his expression unreadable as always, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw making him look less like the untouchable man I'd met, and more like someone who had forgotten to rest. "Just the garden," I said. The rain stopped. His eyes flicked toward me, and for a second I thought I saw a trace of something softer in them, something dangerously close to trust. "Stay near the fountain," he said quietly. "Nowhere else." "I promise," I replied, though we both knew promises in this house were fragile things. Matteo grabbed my hand as we stepped outside, his small fingers cold against mine. The air was heavy but sweet, the kind that comes after a storm, when the world still feels half asleep. The roses along the stone wall dripped with silver water, and the grass shone like glass. Matteo ran ahead toward the fountain, laughing without sound, his joy almost too bright against the gray morning. I followed, slower, breathing in the scent of rain and freedom, both equally rare. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the world had remembered how to be kind. We spent hours there, or maybe it just felt like hours, the kind of timelessness that only exists when you're happy without realizing it. Matteo showed me the caterpillars he'd found crawling along the roses, traced letters into puddles with his finger, and tried to teach me a few new signs he'd invented himself, his creativity boundless and chaotic. When he asked to draw, I sat on the edge of the fountain, watching him sketch the mansion with surprising accuracy, each window and shadow captured as if he'd memorized every inch of his cage. And then, just as the sun began to break through the clouds, I heard it, a sharp crack that didn't belong to the calm morning air. Gunfire. The sound ripped through the garden, clean and merciless, echoing off the stone walls before my mind could even name it. I froze. Matteo's head jerked up, eyes wide, his pencil falling from his hand. I moved before I could think, running to him, grabbing his shoulders. "Inside!" I shouted, forgetting he couldn't hear me. His confusion lasted only a second before instinct took over. He clung to me, trembling. Another shot, closer this time, then shouting from somewhere beyond the gate. Men's voices, harsh, panicked. The garden erupted with motion. Birds scattered into the sky, and the distant hum of engines roared like thunder. I turned toward the mansion, but the path was too open. There was no cover, nowhere safe to run. "Matteo," I whispered, crouching in front of him, forcing him to meet my eyes. I signed hide, behind the fountain. He shook his head violently, tears forming, but I pushed him toward it anyway. "Do it!" The sound of boots on gravel reached us before I could take another breath. 3 men in dark jackets appeared at the far end of the path, guns raised, faces obscured by masks. One of them pointed straight at me. My heart stopped, then a figure burst from the terrace behind us, moving fast, the sound of his voice cutting through the chaos. "Isabella! Down!" Damiano. He fired before the men could react, his shots precise, surgical. 2 went down instantly, the third ducked behind the hedge, firing blindly. The world became a blur of noise and motion, the crack of bullets, the sting of stone fragments hitting my skin, the scent of gunpowder mixing with rain. Damiano was already in front of me, his body shielding mine, his hand reaching back to grab Matteo from where he crouched behind the fountain. "Are you hurt?" he barked, voice rough. "No," I gasped. "Good, don't move." He turned, firing again, the recoil barely moving his arm. I'd seen him composed before, cold, unreadable, but this was different. This was fury made flesh, every muscle controlled, every breath measured, the rhythm of a man who knew violence like language. He moved with terrifying grace, every motion precise, as if the world slowed to match his will. The last man fled toward the gate, shouting something in Italian that I couldn't catch before disappearing into the trees. Damiano lowered his weapon, scanning the perimeter with the instinct of someone who expected betrayal, even from shadows. The silence that followed was too sudden, too sharp. I realized I was shaking. He turned to me then, his expression breaking for just an instant. "Are you sure you're not hurt?" I nodded, though my voice failed. His gaze shifted to Matteo, who stood gripping my arm, tears streaking his face, his small body trembling. Damiano knelt in front of him, taking his hands gently, forcing him to focus. He signed slowly, imperfectly. "Safe. Promise. Papa here." Matteo threw himself into his father's arms, sobbing silently. Damiano held him tight, eyes closing, jaw clenched. It was the kind of embrace that carried both apology and prayer. I stood a few feet away, unable to breathe for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Because in that moment, I understood what no one else in this house seemed to see. That Damiano Moretti was not just dangerous. He was haunted. Every bullet he fired, every order he gave, every wall he built around his son was penance for a sin that refused to die. When he finally stood, Matteo clinging to his leg, his voice was quieter, rawer. "They came for me," he said, "but they would have taken you to get to him." "Who?" I asked, but he shook his head. "Not now. Get him inside." The rest of the day unfolded like a fever dream. The police never came, of course they didn't, and the staff moved quickly, efficiently, as if this were not the first time blood had touched the garden stones. Damiano disappeared for hours, barking orders into his phone, his tone clipped and deadly. When he returned at dusk, he was no longer just a man. He was something colder, a storm in human form. He found me in Matteo's room, where I sat beside the sleeping boy. The moment he entered, I saw the cracks in his armor, the exhaustion, the guilt. "I told you to stay by the fountain," he said quietly. "I did," I replied. "They found us anyway." His eyes met mine, and the anger in them melted into something else. Fear, maybe. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "If anything had happened to you." He stopped, exhaled, shook his head as if the thought itself burned. "I can't protect both of you forever." "You don't have to," I said. "You just have to stop pretending you can't be saved." He stared at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, his mask slipped entirely. He looked broken, human, terrified of what it meant to care. Then he reached up, almost hesitantly, his fingers brushing my cheek, tracing the small cut there from flying stone. "You should have never come here," he murmured. "Maybe I was meant to." We stood like that for a long moment, suspended between danger and something far more dangerous. Then a knock at the door shattered it. Matteo's bodyguard, pale and tense. "Boss," he said, "it's not over. They know about her." Damiano turned, his voice suddenly sharp again. "What did you say?" "They know who she is. They want her next." And in that instant, the quiet safety I'd built with Matteo, the fragile understanding with Damiano, all of it fractured. Because for the first time, I realized that whatever had begun as a job had become a war. And I was no longer just a bystander. I was the reason the wolves had found their way to the door. The night after the attack felt like it belonged to another world, one where thunder never stopped echoing and every shadow looked like the memory of a gun. The mansion, normally so still, breathed around me with nervous life, doors opening and closing softly, murmured voices in the hall, the low hum of engines idling outside the gates. Danger had not passed, it had only changed shape. And in the center of it all stood Damiano Moretti, still and watchful, the gravity around which everything spun. I couldn't sleep. Matteo lay safe in the next room, his breathing steady, his hand curled around the stuffed bear he never admitted he loved. I sat by the window, watching lightning flicker far beyond the hills, thinking of how easily peace can be mistaken for safety. I thought of Damiano's hand on my face, the tremor in his voice when he said he couldn't protect us forever. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession he hadn't meant to make. When I finally stepped into the corridor, the house felt empty, but a single line of light leaked from under his study door. I followed it as though it were a trail meant only for me. I didn't knock. I just entered, drawn by something that had nothing to do with sense. He was there, of course he was, standing by the window, a glass in his hand, shirt sleeves rolled up, the faint gleam of his watch catching the lamplight. Papers were spread across the desk, maps, photographs, blueprints of the world that kept trying to destroy him. He didn't look at me, but I knew he'd known I was coming. He always did. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." "I don't sleep much." "Because you're afraid of what you'll see?" I asked, then instantly regretted it. His shoulders stiffened. "Because sleep feels like surrender." I stepped closer. "And you don't surrender?" He turned then, eyes dark but not cold. "I used to think I couldn't afford to. Now I'm starting to think I've been surrendering all along. To guilt. To ghosts. To a life that should have ended years ago." He set the glass down and crossed the room toward me. I wanted to step back, but my body didn't listen. The space between us shrank until I could see the faint scar just below his jaw, the one Matteo had traced once in a drawing. "You think I don't see what this place does to people?" he said quietly. "Every man who works for me dies a little every day. I built this house to keep my son safe, but it's nothing more than a mausoleum made of money and fear." "Then let it fall," I whispered. His laugh was soft and bitter. "If I let it fall, the world takes him with it. And you?" I stopped mattering the day they killed her. The words hung in the air like a blade. I waited, knowing if I spoke too soon, he'd retreat behind silence again. Finally, he said, "They wanted me dead. I was stupid enough to believe that keeping secrets would keep them safe. My wife paid the price, and Matteo lost everything that made him a child. I wanted to touch him, but I didn't. I only said, 'You blame yourself for something you couldn't control.'" He looked at me then, and for once his gaze wasn't a weapon, it was a wound. "You sound like her. Maybe she was right." "She was," he said, voice breaking. "That's what destroyed her." He turned away, bracing both hands against the desk as though holding the world in place. I went to him anyway, standing close enough to see the fine tremor in his fingers. "You told me once that love ruins families," I said. "But maybe it isn't love that ruins them, maybe it's fear." He didn't move. "Fear keeps people alive." "No," I said softly. "It keeps them alone." The silence stretched between us until it was almost unbearable. Then he spoke again, lower, rawer. "You think I don't feel it? Every time you walk into a room, every time he smiles because of you, every time I remember what peace used to look like. I feel it. And it terrifies me, because you don't trust it, because I don't deserve it." The confession cracked something open in both of us. I reached out, my hand finding his, and for a long time neither of us said anything. His palm was warm, his grip hesitant, the touch of a man who feared breaking what he held. He turned his head slightly, eyes meeting mine, and I could see the storm there. Grief, desire, guilt, all of it tangled and unspoken. "If I start to care again," he said, "someone dies. That's how it works." Maybe caring is the only thing that keeps you human. He drew a sharp breath, the kind that sounds like pain. "You should hate me for bringing you here." "I don't." "You should run." "I won't." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the mask was gone. "Then I'm already lost." He lifted my hand and pressed it against his chest. His heartbeat was frantic, uneven, too loud in the quiet room. "Do you feel that?" he asked. "Every time you're near, it reminds me I'm still alive. I don't know if I want to be." I swallowed hard, unable to find words. "You are," I said finally, "and you're allowed to be." For a moment, everything slowed. The rain outside, the clock on the wall, even the ache in my chest. He leaned forward slightly, not enough to touch, just enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my temple. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he murmured. "Maybe I do." He smiled then, barely, but it was real, and stepped back as though distance was the only way to survive what lingered between us. "Go back to your room," he said, "before I say something I can't take back." I didn't move. "Damiano, please." It was the first time I'd ever heard him use the word. It was not command, but surrender. I left before I could make him regret it. In the hallway, my pulse wouldn't steady. Behind me, the light under his door dimmed. Somewhere in the mansion's belly, the generator hummed to life, and rain began again, steady and unrelenting. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard the quiet confession hidden in his voice. He thought love was a curse. I was beginning to think it was the only thing that could save us both. When dawn came, pale and merciless, I found another envelope slipped beneath my door. The handwriting familiar and unsteady this time, as though written in haste. "If I fall, keep him safe. You're the only one who can." Morning came like a lie, bright and gold and pretending that nothing in the night had cracked open. The storm had passed, the air smelled of salt and iron, and the marble floors of the Moretti mansion glimmered as if polished by ghosts. I moved through the house in silence, pretending I was just the tutor again, pretending that my heart hadn't started to recognize the rhythm of a man's guilt as if it were its own pulse. Matteo sat at the kitchen table drawing tiny suns in the margins of his workbook. Damiano was gone, of course, vanished into the machinery of his empire where daylight never reached. The house was too still. Stillness had become a warning here, a sound that wasn't silence but waiting. By noon, the security men had changed shifts twice, and the bodyguard posted by the garden door avoided my eyes. When I asked where Damiano was, he said only, "Meeting." And that word, simple as it was, carried the metallic taste of danger. I spent the afternoon trying to distract Matteo with stories. We sat on the carpet with toy soldiers between us, my voice describing the brave knight who could not speak, but still saved his kingdom because he listened better than anyone else. Matteo signed, "That's me," and I laughed, though the sound felt hollow. He drew the knight's castle next, a fortress surrounded by water, a bridge raised high. He wrote one word under it in clumsy letters, "Trapped." "Why trapped?" I asked. He tapped his chest, then pointed to the drawing. "Because Papa built it." Something in my throat closed. I wanted to tell him that walls can protect and destroy in the same breath. But before I could, the phone on the table rang. A sharp sound that didn't belong in our small, fragile piece. The bodyguard answered. I watched his face change, watched color drain from it, until he looked almost carved from ash. When he hung up, He didn't look at me right away. "Boss says you and the kid stay inside," he said finally, his voice unsteady. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone." "Why? What happened?" He didn't answer. He was already moving, shouting orders down the hall, the house erupting into sudden motion, men running, radios crackling, the dull echo of boots on tile. Matteo looked at me, eyes wide, his small hands trembling as he signed. "Danger?" I nodded, forcing calm I didn't feel. "Stay with me." We locked ourselves in the study, the one place Matteo loved, the shelves smelling of old paper and the faint trace of Damiano's cologne. Outside, voices rose and fell like a storm building, until suddenly there was nothing. No sound, no movement, only the thudding of my heart. I tried calling Damiano, but the line was dead. Every second stretched thin, sharp, unbearable. Then the power flickered. Once, twice. The lights died. The world went black. Matteo whimpered, clutching my arm. I knelt beside him, whispering even though he couldn't hear. "It's okay, sweetheart. I've got you." The emergency lights came on, faint and red, painting the room in a color that looked too much like blood. I reached for my phone. No signal. A noise came from the hall. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the brisk rhythm of Damiano's guards. I froze, every nerve in my body turning to glass. Matteo saw my face and knew. I pressed a finger to my lips, gestured for him to crawl behind the desk. He obeyed, small and quick, eyes huge in the dim light. The door handle turned. "Miss Rossi." A voice I didn't recognize, smooth and calm, too calm. "We don't want to hurt the boy. Just come out." I didn't answer. My hands shook as I looked around for anything to use as a weapon. My eyes fell on the heavy bronze paperweight shaped like a lion, Damiano's crest engraved along its mane. I grabbed it, my breath shallow, my body trembling so hard it felt like fear had learned to move my limbs for me. The door burst open. 3 men entered, dark coats, cold eyes, the wrong kind of silence about them. One of them smiled when he saw me. "There she is," he said, "the boss's little teacher." "Don't," I said, though I didn't know what I was begging for. "Where's the kid?" I stepped sideways, blocking their view of the desk. "Gone," I lied. "Damiano took him hours ago." The man laughed. "He's not as smart as he thinks. Neither are you." He lunged. I swung the paperweight with everything I had. It connected with his jaw. He cursed, stumbling back, blood already blooming at the corner of his mouth. Another grabbed my wrist, twisting until pain shot through me, the bronze lion falling from my hand. "Enough!" he snapped, and before I could scream, a gun pressed against my temple. Cold, final. Then from behind the desk, a small movement. Matteo, eyes blazing, threw the inkwell. It shattered against the man's arm, black liquid spilling like shadow. The distraction lasted a second, but it was enough. I drove my elbow backward into the man's ribs, kicked free, grabbed Matteo, and ran. The hall was chaos. More men, shouting. A gunshot split the air, splinters of wood biting my cheek. Matteo clung to me, sobbing silently. I turned a corner and almost collided with one of Damiano's guards, his face pale, his gun drawn. "They've got the perimeter," he gasped. "Go, garage, now!" We ran. Down the servant stairs, through the wine cellar, every corridor stretching longer than the last. Another shot. Closer. My lungs burned. My legs felt like fire. But Matteo's small hand in mine kept me moving. We reached the heavy door that led to the underground garage. The guard swiped his card. The door opened an inch, and then a hand yanked him back into the dark. A muffled cry. A thud. Silence. The door slammed shut from the other side. Matteo's grip tightened. His lips formed one word. "Papa." I didn't have time to answer. A voice echoed from behind us, the same smooth tone as before. "You should have stayed in your pretty room, Miss Rossi." I turned, shielding Matteo, with my body. You want me, not him. That's the plan. He stepped into the dim light, gun leveled. I thought I was about to die, and all I could think was that Damiano would never forgive himself. Then a shot rang out, but not from his gun. The man dropped, his weapon clattering to the floor. Behind him, Damiano stood, breathing hard, eyes blazing, blood on his sleeve. He looked at me, then at Matteo, and something fierce and wordless passed between them. Go! He barked. Get him out! We ran together this time, Damiano covering our escape, firing into shadows that screamed back. We reached the car, the engine already running, and as I pushed Matteo inside, I heard the click of another gun, saw the flash of metal too late. Damiano shoved me aside. The bullet hit him square in the shoulder. He stumbled, caught himself on the car door, his teeth gritted against the pane. Drive, he said. I can't leave you. Drive! Blood soaked through his shirt, dark and spreading. He reached for Matteo's face, his hand trembling. Don't be afraid, he said softly, words Matteo couldn't hear, but somehow seemed to understand. Then he turned to me, voice low, almost gentle. Keep him safe. Promise me. I promise, I whispered. He smiled then, faint but real, and his hand fell away. I drove because it was the only thing left to do, because love sometimes means running towards safety when your heart is still behind you, bleeding on the ground. In the mirror, the mansion disappeared into the fog. Matteo sobbed silently against my arm. I wanted to tell him everything would be all right, but lies taste bitter in the mouth. When we finally stopped miles away, hidden beneath the overpass where the rain had started again, I pressed a trembling hand against the wound in Damiano's shoulder. He was pale but conscious, his eyes fixed on Matteo. Don't let him see, he murmured. Stay with me, I said. You're going to be fine. He smiled faintly. You always lie beautifully. And then his head fell back against the seat, his breathing shallow, the rain whispering against the roof like a prayer I didn't know how to finish. The rain refused to stop that night, as though the sky itself had decided to mourn. Every drop against the windshield sounded like a clock counting down, a reminder that time was bleeding out as fast as the man beside me. Damiano's head rested against the window, his skin ashen, his breath shallow but steady enough to keep hope alive. Matteo sat in the back seat, knees pulled to his chest, eyes wide and unblinking, clutching the little bear he had refused to leave behind. I could see the fear written all over him, that helpless kind of terror that children feel when they realize even the adults are afraid. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other pressed against Damiano's shoulder, the blood slick and warm beneath my fingers. Stay with me, I whispered, though I knew he couldn't possibly respond. He moved once, a low sound caught in his throat, and for a moment I thought he was gone. But then his eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused, searching for something. Me, maybe, or the boy in the back seat, or the last fragment of his strength. Don't stop, he muttered, his voice breaking like glass. I'm not, I said, though I didn't even know where I was going. Roads blurred into darkness, landmarks disappeared into fog. I only knew that I had to keep moving, that if I stopped, the world would find us and finish what it had started. Eventually I saw a faint light through the rain, a flicker from an old roadside chapel, half forgotten and overgrown. I turned sharply, the tires slipping in the mud, and parked beneath the broken awning. The small church looked abandoned, shuttered windows, cracked bell tower, but the door gave way when I pushed. Inside, it smelled of dust and candle wax, and there was a silence that didn't feel hostile. I brought Damiano inside first, his weight heavy against me, his body trembling with every step. Matteo followed close, his small hand clutching the edge of my coat. I laid Damiano across the front pew, his blood staining the old wood, and knelt beside him. My hands shook as I tore my scarf into strips, pressing them hard against the wound. "You're going to live," I said, the words half a prayer, half a command. "Do you hear me? You don't get to leave us." He managed a faint smile, his lips pale. "You always giving orders now?" Relief hit me so hard it almost hurt. "Apparently, yes." He tried to laugh but winced instead. "Mateo?" I glanced over. The boy was sitting on the floor, hugging his knees, watching us with that too-old gaze that broke me a little every time. I signed to him. "He's okay. Just hurt." Mateo nodded but didn't move. He kept his eyes on his father as though watching would somehow keep him alive. The rain beat harder against the roof, and thunder rolled in the distance. But for the first time since the attack, I felt something strange. Control. Fragile. Temporary. But real. I could fix this. I had to. I tore more fabric, cleaned the wound as best I could, my hands covered in his blood, my heart pounding. Damiano's eyes followed every movement, and in them I saw something I hadn't before. Trust. Raw and unguarded. "You shouldn't have come back for me," he whispered. "I wasn't leaving you. You could have saved yourself. Without you, there's nothing left to save." He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening, and for a long moment the only sound was rain and the rhythm of our breathing. Then he spoke again, softer. "You're not made for this world, Isabella." "Maybe your world was waiting for me," I said. "Maybe it just needed someone who remembered how to listen." That made him open his eyes again, the faintest spark of something, fragile and dangerous, lighting there. "You should hate me," he said. "I brought this to your door." "I don't hate you." My voice trembled. "I hate what it's done to you." Something in him shifted at that. He reached for my hand, fingers slick with blood, and held it against his chest, his heartbeat unsteady but still there. "If I die..." "Don't," I said sharply. "You're not dying. Not like this. Not tonight." But he only smiled, the kind of smile that feels like surrender. "If I die," he continued, "promise me you'll take him far away. Somewhere with light, somewhere I can't follow." I shook my head, tears blurring the edges of everything. "You'll tell him that yourself." He started to speak again, but Mateo suddenly stood, pointing toward the door, eyes wide. At first I thought it was the storm, but then I saw headlights slicing through the dark, stopping just beyond the chapel gate. My stomach dropped. "They found us," I whispered. Damiano forced himself upright, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Get him out." "There's nowhere to go." "Yes, there is." He pointed to a small side door near the altar. "It leads to the bell tower. Old stairs. Hide there until I come." "You can't fight like this. I've fought worse." I wanted to argue, to scream, to lock the door and never let him move again, but I knew it would be useless. The man before me was not someone who asked for permission to be a hero. He simply became one. He grabbed his gun from his belt, checking the clip with shaking hands, then looked at me. "If I don't come back..." "You will," I said, cutting him off, because if I let him finish, I'd break. He looked at me then, the way a drowning man looks at the surface. Like maybe it's salvation, maybe it's death. But either way, it's the only thing left worth reaching for. Then he turned and disappeared into the rain. I pulled Mateo into the tower, my heart hammering so loudly it felt like the whole building could hear it. The staircase creaked beneath our feet, the smell of rust and dust thick in the air. We hid behind the old bell, its bronze surface cold against my back. Mateo was trembling, and I held him close, whispering over and over, "He'll come back. He always does." Then the gunfire started. It was close. Too close. The sound of metal against stone, shouts, the rain swallowing half of it, but not enough. Mateo buried his face in my shoulder, and I closed my eyes, praying in a language I didn't believe in, praying that fate would remember it owed us one moment of mercy. The minutes dragged, every second stretched to eternity, until the noise finally stopped. The silence afterward was worse. "Stay here," I whispered, though my legs shook as I stood. Matteo clung to my sleeve, but I smiled, signing, "I'll be right back. Promise." I went down the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The door was open now, the night wind cutting through it. The rain had eased to a whisper, the air filled with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. 2 cars were still running outside, doors open, lights glaring into the chapel's dark. Bodies lay in the mud, faceless shapes that I couldn't look at too closely. I stepped through the doorway, heart in my throat. And then I saw him. Damiano, standing in the rain, blood down his arm, his gun still raised. His chest heaved with each breath, his face pale but alive. He turned when he heard my steps, and in that single instant, everything, the chaos, the fear, the distance we'd built between us, fell away. "It's over," he said hoarsely. "They're gone." I ran to him, not thinking, just moving, just feeling. When I reached him, he caught me against him, his body trembling, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You shouldn't have come down. You shouldn't have gone out," I said. He laughed softly, weakly. "Always arguing." "Always living," I answered. We stood there for a long time, rain mixing with blood, the world finally quiet. Matteo appeared in the doorway, small and fragile and safe, and Damiano looked at him with something like awe. "We're going home," he said quietly. But I saw the wound reopening on his shoulder, the way his hand trembled when he tried to wipe the rain from his eyes. He was alive, but barely. And as I led him back into the chapel, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still waiting for us beyond the horizon. Dawn came too early, or maybe it never truly came at all. The sky above the chapel was pale and colorless, as though the world had been drained of everything except exhaustion. Damiano sat on the steps outside, his wounded shoulder bandaged with strips of my torn blouse, his gun lying useless beside him. Matteo slept on a pew inside, his face finally peaceful after a night of silent terror, his small hand still gripping the edge of my scarf, as though holding on to proof that I was still real. The air was heavy with smoke from the burnt-out cars, and the scent of it clung to my skin. I stood behind Damiano, watching him, the curve of his back, the way his hair clung damply to his neck. He looked like a man carved from the aftermath of war, still upright only because he didn't know how to fall. "We can't stay here," I said quietly. "I know. They'll come again. They always do." He didn't look at me when he said it, just stared out across the empty road as though waiting for the next enemy to appear. I wanted to reach for him, to touch the part of him that still believed he could protect us. But there was something in his silence that stopped me. A weight too sacred or too broken to disturb. "What are you going to do?" I asked. He finally turned then, and the look in his eyes was enough to steal the air from my lungs. "Finish it," he said simply. "Finish what?" "The blood debt." The words sounded old, ancient, like something that had been carved into his family's bones generations ago. "Damiano, you're hurt. You can barely stand." "I've survived worse," he said, his tone steady, his conviction terrifying. "If I don't end this now, they'll keep coming. For me. For him. For you." He picked up the gun, checked the clip, and slipped it beneath his jacket with practiced ease. I stepped closer, my voice trembling despite myself. "You can't do this alone." "I already did," he said softly. "The night she died." I froze. It was the first time he had spoken of his wife without bitterness, the first time the memory sounded like penance instead of fury. "What do you mean?" He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "They came for me that night. I wasn't home. She called, said she heard something. I told her to hide, that I was on my way. But I was too far. They found her before I did. Matteo was in her arms when the house exploded. He lived because she covered him. She died because of me. He looked up then, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it almost felt wrong to witness it. So don't tell me not to finish this, Isabella. Don't ask me to stop being what I have to be. I've already buried too much of myself to turn back now. You think killing them will bring her back? No, he said, shaking his head. But maybe it will let her rest. There was nothing I could say. The air between us was thick with everything unsaid. Fear, love, desperation, and the terrible understanding that sometimes salvation and damnation wear the same face. Finally, I whispered, "Then let me come with you." He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the argument building behind his eyes. "No," he said at last. "You stay with him. You're the only thing that keeps him safe now." "Damiano?" He reached out suddenly, his hand finding my cheek, his thumb brushing a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "You've given me more peace in a few weeks than I've had in my entire life. But peace is a luxury I can't afford until this ends. Then promise me you'll come back." He smiled faintly. "I don't make promises I can't keep." And before I could stop him, he leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. His breath was warm, his voice barely audible. "Take care of him, Isabella. And if I don't, I whispered, my voice breaking. "Don't say it." But he didn't need to. The words hung there between us, unspoken but understood. He turned, walked down the steps, and into the mist. I watched him go until the fog swallowed him whole, leaving only silence in his wake. The next hours passed in fragments. I fed Matteo, tried to smile, told him that his father was just fixing things. He nodded, but his eyes were too sharp, too aware. He sat by the window, watching the road, waiting. Every few minutes he would sign, "When?" and I would answer, soon, though I didn't know if I believed it. By afternoon, the rain returned, gentle at first, then steady. The chapel grew darker, colder. My nerves felt like live wires. Every sound, a branch against the roof, the distant echo of a car, made my heart leap. I kept seeing his face, that quiet resignation in his eyes, the way he'd said finish it as though there was no other choice. When the first car appeared on the horizon, I thought it was him. I ran to the door, breath catching. But as it drew closer, I saw the wrong kind of silhouette inside. Shadows where there should have been light. I grabbed Matteo, pulled him behind the pews. My pulse roared in my ears. The car stopped outside. Doors opened. Voices. Laughter. Cruel. Deliberate. Confident. I knew that sound. It was the sound of men who believed they'd already won. One of them called out, "We know you're in there, little teacher. The boss sends his regards." I froze. They weren't here for Damiano. They were here for us. Matteo gripped my sleeve, his fingers shaking as he signed, "Papa?" I swallowed hard. "He'll come." The door burst open. 2 men entered, rain dripping from their coats, guns raised. I stood slowly, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. "He's not here," I said. "You're wasting your time." One of them smiled. "Then you'll do." Before I could move, a gunshot shattered the air, not from them, but from outside. Both men spun toward the doorway, firing blindly. Another shot followed, precise and final. The first man fell. The second ran for cover, but a shadow moved through the doorway, fast, fluid, lethal. Damiano. He looked like a man who'd already walked through hell to get here. Blood on his collar, rain in his eyes, the weight of 1,000 ghosts in his expression. He fired once more. The second man collapsed. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. I exhaled a sound that was half sob, half relief. You came back." He turned toward me, but before he could speak, movement flickered in the doorway. A flash of metal, a muzzle flare. The shot was deafening. I screamed, lunging forward too late. Damiano staggered, eyes wide, the impact spinning him sideways. The last gunman, the one I hadn't seen, dropped an instant later from his own wound, but the damage was done. Damiano fell to his knees, blood blooming across his chest like a dark flower. I caught him before he hit the ground, my hands pressed to the wound, my heart splitting open with the sight. "No," I whispered. "No, please, stay with me." He looked up at me, his lips pale, his breath ragged. "I told you," he murmured, voice barely there. "I don't make promises I can't keep." And then his eyes drifted toward Matteo, who stood frozen a few feet away, tears streaming silently down his face. Damiano tried to lift his hand, reaching for his son, but his strength faltered. His gaze met mine again, full of everything he could never say aloud. Then the light left, his eyes. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The sound tore through the chapel, raw and endless. Matteo ran to me, his small hands on my arm, shaking, trying to understand. Outside, thunder rolled like an answer from heaven that came too late. And as I held Damiano Moretti's body in my arms, the blood soaking into my dress, I realized the silence he'd lived in had finally won. The man who had ruled the city through fear and fire had died in absolute quiet. But even then, I refused to believe it was over. Because the way his hand lay open against mine, warm still, defiant still, felt less like an ending, and more like a promise. The days that followed blurred together like watercolor left too long in the rain, every edge softening until I couldn't tell where grief ended and survival began. The police came, late and indifferent, their questions brittle and rehearsed, their sympathy shallow. They didn't know who Damiano Moretti had been beyond the headlines. They didn't understand that the man they zipped into a black bag had once taught a boy how to smile again. They left without answers, and I stayed behind to gather what was left of a life built from shadows. The mansion felt different when we returned. It was quieter, yes, but not empty. More like it was waiting. The walls no longer whispered fear, only memory. Matteo walked through the corridors slowly, touching the furniture as though reacquainting himself with ghosts. He didn't cry anymore. His silence was heavier than tears, a silence that knew too much. I followed him from room to room, feeling both guardian and intruder, half alive, half caught in the echo of a man's final breath. Everywhere I looked, he was still there, his coat draped over the back of a chair, his glass still on the desk, the faint smell of tobacco and cedar that clung to the curtains. I kept expecting him to step from the shadows, say something low and impossible like he used to, tell me that the world hadn't ended, that all of this was just another one of his tests. But the silence stayed. It filled every space he had once occupied, and though it broke me, it also reminded me of him. Because even in death, Damiano Moretti had managed to make silence feel alive. Matteo found me in the garden one afternoon, the same garden where the gunfire had started weeks ago. The roses had survived, impossibly. Their petals were torn, but they still bloomed. He sat beside me, tracing the wet stone of the fountain with one small hand. Then he signed, slowly. "He's gone." I nodded, unable to speak. After a long pause, he added, "He said you make him hear." The tears came then, unbidden and unstoppable. I pulled him close, held him against my chest, and whispered, "Then maybe I'll keep talking, so he never forgets the sound." He couldn't hear the words, but somehow I think he understood. That night, I went into Damiano's study for the first time since the funeral. The desk was exactly as he'd left it, papers stacked, a single photograph at the center. Matteo as a baby in his mother's arms, Damiano standing behind them, younger, unscarred, his smile faint but real. I traced the edge of the photo with my fingertip and found an envelope beneath it, sealed, my name written in his hand. My breath caught. I sat down before opening it, afraid of what it might say, afraid of what it might not. Inside was a single page, the handwriting uneven, as though written in haste. Isabella, if you're reading this, then the world has already taken its due. Don't waste your life mourning a man who only ever knew how to fight. Take him, our son now, because that's what you've become to him, and show him the world beyond these gates. Teach him to see beauty where I only saw war. You once told me fear keeps people alone. You were right. You made me remember what it felt like not to be afraid. That is the only forgiveness I ever needed. D. I pressed the letter to my lips, breathing in the ghost of his words. Forgiveness. That was all he'd ever wanted, all he'd never believed he deserved. And somehow he had given it to me instead. When we left the mansion a week later, the city had begun to heal in its own ruthless way. Rumors dying, territories shifting, the Moretti name whispered less like a curse and more like a myth. I sold the house quietly, keeping only one thing. The lion-shaped paperweight, its bronze surface still scarred from the night everything changed. Matteo carried it in his backpack as though it were a relic. We moved to a small town by the sea, the kind of place where mornings smell like salt and bread, and no one asks about your past. Matteo started school again. He learned to sign with other children, learned to laugh without fear. He began to draw the ocean almost every day. Blue waves, open skies, the faint outline of a man standing on the shore. Sometimes he would hand me a drawing and sign, "He's watching." I'd nod, because I wanted to believe it too. At night, when he was asleep, I'd walk along the beach alone. The sea always reminded me of Damiano, beautiful, vast, impossible to hold. I'd think about how love had found us in the most dangerous place, how it had grown like a flame refusing to die even when the wind turned cruel. He had once told me he didn't make promises he couldn't keep, but I realized now he had kept the only one that mattered. He'd made sure we lived. One evening, months later, as I sat on the shore watching the sun disappear, Matteo ran toward me from the water's edge, his hair dripping, his smile wild. He signed something I didn't understand at first, then pointed behind me. I turned and froze. The horizon glowed with gold, the sun sinking into the sea. And in that light, for the briefest moment, I saw him. Not the man covered in blood and regret, but the one who had once stood by the fountain teaching his son how to make the sign for Gyel, love. He smiled, quiet, proud, and then the light shifted, and he was gone. Matteo tugged at my sleeve, signing again. He said, "We're safe now." I pulled him close, kissed the top of his head, and whispered, "Yes, we are." We stayed there until the stars came, and the sound of the waves became our lullaby. I thought of the letter, of the word he'd left me, forgiveness, and realized it wasn't about absolution for what he'd done, but permission for me to keep living, to keep listening, to keep loving. It's been 3 years now. Matteo's hearing is returning little by little, miracles stitched together by time and patience. Sometimes I catch him humming tunelessly to himself, testing the new world of sound around him. The first time he did it, I cried so hard he didn't understand why. He asked once if his father could hear us in heaven. I told him that love has its own frequency, one that never dies, one that passes through walls and time and silence. He nodded, and that night he left a drawing on my pillow. A lion standing beneath the stars, a small boy beside it holding a woman's hand. I keep it on the wall above my bed. Some nights, when the wind rushes through the open window, I swear I hear it, the faintest whisper, low and steady, like a heartbeat wrapped in the sea's breath. It's not a voice exactly, but I know what it says. you're home. And somehow I am.